Imagine being the new kid in the galaxy, and for nearly 50 years, everyone just assumes you're too scared to come out and play. In the colossal Great Hall of the Galactic Concord, a place so big it stretched for almost a mile, that's exactly what was happening to humanity. The ceiling was a live feed of the star-dusted cosmos, and below it, representatives from 214 different alien species filled the tiered seats. At the center of it all stood High Chancellor Morveth, her silver robes shimmering under the starlight. She was almost 400 years old and had seen it all, leading this assembly for 60 straight years of, well, mostly talking. Her voice echoed through the hall, flawlessly translated for every kind of ear or listening organ. "We begin the roll call," she announced, her tone heavy with routine. "Let the record show attendance for the 47th Annual Summit." One by one, the names were called in alphabetical order. The Authority Collective, present. The Belmathi Trade Union, present. It was a ritual that droned on for nearly an hour. Then, the automated system called out, "Terran Confederation." And just like that, the entire massive hall fell silent. Every eye, every sensor, every strange and wonderful face turned to a single empty chair in the observers section. That chair had been sitting there, empty, for 47 years, ever since humanity first got the invitation to join the Galactic Club. "Terran Confederation," the system repeated, after a programmed pause. Still nothing. A wave of whispers and murmurs washed through the crowd. High Chancellor Morveth just made a quick note on her screen. "Let the record show that the Terran Confederation has declined attendance for the 47th consecutive year. We shall proceed." But from the upper levels, a loud, barking laugh cut through the air. It was Ambassador Breath of the Colossi Dominion, a massive creature whose scales were glowing a deep, ugly purple, the color of pure contempt. "Why do we even bother?" he boomed, his voice dripping with scorn. "The humans are just a bunch of primitive cowards hiding on their little rock behind a single star. They have nothing to offer us." A few other delegates grumbled in agreement. To them, humans were a nobody species from the boring outer edge of the galaxy, discovered by a survey ship 80 years ago and pretty much forgotten ever since. High Chancellor Morveth simply raised a hand. "The invitation remains open. It's protocol," she said flatly. "All spacefaring species are entitled to a seat. If the humans don't want to take it, that's their loss." And just like every year before, the subject was dropped. The summit moved on to the real crisis, the Rakari hegemony. For the last 30 years, the Rakari, a ruthless warrior species with a taste for empire, had been tearing through the galaxy. They'd already conquered dozens of smaller civilizations, turning millions of beings into slaves to power their war machine. Ambassador Karath of the Rakari just sat there, his scarred face a perfect mask of indifference, as speaker after speaker condemned his people. He'd heard it all before. Empty words, toothless threats. "The Concord must act," cried the Salathi Republic's representative. "We can't just watch as whole cultures are erased." But Ambassador Breath just scoffed. "And do what? Start a war? The cost would be unimaginable. We have to use diplomacy." The Salathi shot back. "We've been trying diplomacy for 30 years. How many more have to fall before we admit it's not working?" The argument raged for hours. Ideas were tossed around and shot down. Sanctions were considered but called too weak. A military response was mentioned and then immediately dismissed as being too risky and too expensive. In the end, the summit did what it always did. It issued a strongly worded letter of concern. The Rakari ambassador took the document with a smirk, promising his government would give it their full attention. High Chancellor Morveth watched him leave, her heart heavy. 60 years she'd been doing this, and the story was always the same. The powerful do what they want, the weak get crushed, and the rest of them just hold meetings about it. Later that night, Morveth was in her private quarters. Her young aide, Torveth, was waiting for her. "The summit went as expected," Morveth sighed. "Another year, another spectacular waste of time." "Chancellor," Torveth said, his voice tight with worry, "there's something you need to see. Our intelligence division flagged some strange activity in the outer regions." He handed her a data tablet. As Morveth read it, her eyes grew wide. The reports showed sightings of unknown ships in deep space, far from any known routes. The ships were gigantic, bigger than anything in the conquered fleet, and they moved with a speed and grace that hinted at technology far beyond their own. And whenever a conquered patrol tried to get close, the ships would just disappear. "These sightings go back 40 years, Morveth whispered. "Why am I just hearing about this now?" The reports were all filed separately, from different sectors, Torvith explained. No one saw the pattern until an analyst ran a new search. Chancellor, their flight paths. They all traced back to the same spot. Morveth looked up. "Which spot?" Torvith took a deep breath. "Human space." Morveth slowly set the tablet down, staring into space as the pieces clicked together. The humans. Dismissed as primitive, written off as irrelevant. But if this report was true... "Does anyone else know about this?" she asked sharply. "No, Chancellor. The analyst came straight to me, and I came straight to you." "Good. Keep it that way," Morveth commanded, picking up the tablet again. She looked closer. These weren't little scout ships. They were warships. "I want constant passive surveillance on human space, nothing they can detect, and I want a report on my desk every single day." "Yes, Chancellor. What do you think is going on?" Morveth was quiet for a long time, her eyes drifting to the stars outside her window. "I think," she said finally, "that we assumed their silence was weakness. We assumed their absence meant they didn't matter." She turned back to her aide. "What if we were dead wrong?" A galaxy away, in a tiny office on a station nobody important ever visited, a young analyst named Yuki Tanaka was asking herself the same question. Yuki's job was to monitor unimportant species for the Concord. Humanity was number one on that list. For 3 years, she'd sifted through boring data about Earth, finding nothing until today. It all started with a simple question. Why did the humans show up for their first 3 summits and then never come back? The official story was that they got bored. But Yuki dug into the old archives. She watched the recordings of those early meetings, and she saw the human observers. They didn't look bored. They looked furious. Back then, the Conquered was debating what to do about a species called the Melthari, who were being systematically wiped out by their neighbors. The debate was sickeningly familiar. Lots of outrage, lots of condemnation, and zero action. In the end, the Melthari were completely exterminated while the Conquered was still deliberating. The humans had watched the whole pathetic display, taking notes. Then they went home, and they never came back. Yuki found the last message they ever sent. It was short and cold. The Terran Confederation thanks the Galactic Concord for its hospitality and declines further participation at this time. That was it. 80 years of absolute silence. Yuki leaned back, her mind racing. The humans weren't isolationists. They weren't hiding. They were disgusted. They had judged the entire Galactic Concord, found it wanting, and quietly walked away to prepare for a universe they now knew they had to face alone. They weren't savages. They were observers. They had been watching us all along, piecing together a map of the galaxy and its power players. The real question was, what were they going to do with all that intel? She started typing her report, knowing it would probably end up in the digital trash can with all the others. But a knot in her stomach told her this time was different. Something was on the horizon. She could feel it. Out in the blackness between the stars, way off the maps the Conquered bothered to chart, a fleet was gathering. 1,000 ships hanging in the abyss, their lights out, their crews waiting in perfect, disciplined silence. They had been waiting for a very long time, and soon the waiting would be over. Admiral Chen Wei stood at the observation window of the Prometheus, watching the starfield without a word. The flagship of the Terran Defense Fleet was a monster, nearly 3 kilometers from bow to stern, carrying enough firepower to crack a small moon. But for Chen, it was home. She'd spent 40 years in the fleet, climbing the ladder from a bright-eyed ensign on a tiny patrol ship to the commander of humanity's entire military might. She had never once fired a shot in anger at another species. No human had. That was all about to change. "Admiral, the intelligence briefing is ready." Chen turned from the window to see her aide, Commander Marcus Webb. He was young for his rank, barely 50, but he'd proven time and again that he was a sharp officer and someone she could trust. "Let's see it," Chen said. They walked to the ship's command center, a massive circular room buzzing with displays and control stations. The senior staff was already there, their faces set like stone. They'd all seen the early warnings. The main screen flickered to life, showing a recording from the Concord summit that had wrapped up 3 days earlier. Chen watched Ambassador Breath's smug, dismissive remarks about humanity. She watched the assembly argue about the Vicari expansion and, in the end, do absolutely nothing. She'd seen 100 versions of this same recording over the decades. "Same old story," muttered Captain Reynolds, the ship's second in command. "Talk, talk, and more talk." "Not quite the same," Commander Webb cut in. He changed the display to a new image, a space station in a system so remote it was practically invisible on any major star lane. "This is Sanctuary Station. It was set up 12 years ago as a safe haven for refugees fleeing the Vicari conquests. Right now it's home to about 50,000 souls from 30 different species." Chen knew of Sanctuary Station. Human intelligence had been keeping tabs on it since day one. It was one of the only places in the galaxy where the victims of the Vicari could find safety. "The Vicari found it," Webb said, his voice low. "A battle fleet left their space 6 days ago. Based on their current course, they'll reach Sanctuary Station in about 18 hours. A heavy silence fell over the room. Everyone knew what a Vicari fleet did to a station full of refugees. It wouldn't be a battle. It would be a slaughter. The survivors would be killed or dragged away in chains, and Sanctuary Station would be turned into dust, a warning to anyone else who dared to offer help. "And the Concord's response?" Chen asked, though she already knew the answer. "The Concord has called an emergency session to discuss the situation. If they run true to form, they'll debate for a few days before releasing a statement of concern. By then, 50,000 people will be gone." "Of course they will," Chen said. She looked around the room at her officers. These were the men and women she'd served with for years, people she'd trust with her life. They had all trained for this. They had all known this day would come, sooner or later. But knowing something is coming and staring it right in the face are two very different things. "Before we go any further," she said, "I want to remind everyone why we're here. I want to make sure we all understand the choice we are about to make." She walked to the center of the room, where a hologram showed the territory of the Terran Confederation, a tiny cluster of stars on the galaxy's edge. It looked laughably small next to the sprawling empires that ran the show. 80 years ago, a Concord survey ship stumbled upon our home world. We were just figuring out how to travel beyond our own solar system. We were young, a little naive, and thrilled to find out we weren't alone in the universe. Chen touched the display, and it zoomed out to show the whole galaxy. They invited us to join their great civilization. They showed us the wonders of the Concord, the massive trade hubs, the star lanes, the alliance of hundreds of species. We sent our people to their summits, excited to learn how so many different cultures could live together in peace. The display shifted, showing old footage from those first meetings. What we learned broke our hearts. We saw a civilization that had decided injustice was okay, as long as the cost of stopping it was too high. We saw powerful species crush weaker ones while the Concord just looked the other way. We saw entire worlds condemned to slavery because nobody was willing to risk their neck to save them. The footage showed the Melthari crisis, the endless useless debates while an entire species died. The Melthari were wiped out while the Concord held meetings. 12 billion beings erased from existence, and all the Concord did was express its deep concern. Chen paused, letting the bitter memory hang in the air. Our leaders made a choice. We would not be part of a system that allowed such evil to exist. We wouldn't lend our name to an alliance built on looking away. But we also knew we were too weak to change anything. If we spoke up, we'd be silenced or smashed. "So we kept our mouths shut," said Captain Reynolds. "We kept our mouths shut," Chen agreed, "but we didn't stay still." The hologram changed again, revealing humanity's secret. Shipyards hidden inside asteroids, research labs floating in the clouds of gas giants, training grounds scattered across a dozen moons, all of it built in secret, completely invisible to conquered sensors. For 80 years, we prepared. We studied every species in the Concorde. We learned their tech, found their weaknesses. We built a fleet that could stand up to any power in this galaxy. And we watched. The display became a montage of horrors. Intelligence files showing Vicari atrocities in brutal detail. Slave markets, death camps, and conquered worlds stripped bare. We watched the Vicari burn and enslave. We watched the conquered do nothing. We recorded it all, waiting for the one moment we could finally make a difference. "Why did we wait so long?" a young lieutenant asked, his voice tight. "If we had this kind of power, why didn't we use it?" Chen had asked herself that same question 1,000 times. The answer was never simple. Because power without wisdom is just another kind of evil. If we had jumped in before we were ready, before we truly understood the galaxy, we would have just become new conquerors. We would have traded one boot on the galaxy's neck for another. She looked at the young officer with a flicker of understanding in her eyes. "It's easy to use power. It's hard to use it right. We waited because we had to learn how to be strong without becoming the very monsters we planned to fight." The main screen switched back to Sanctuary Station, with the Vicari fleet closing in like sharks. 50,000 people are going to die in 18 hours unless someone does something. The conquered won't. They never do. Chen stood up straight, her voice ringing with authority. "Today, humanity does something. Today, we show the galaxy who we are. Not conquerors, not tyrants, protectors." She turned to her communications officer. "Signal the fleet. All ships prepare for combat. We make the jump in 12 hours. "Admiral, the entire fleet?" The officer's voice was filled with shock. "That's over 1,000 ships." "I'm aware of how many ships I have, Lieutenant." "Yes, Admiral. Sending the signal now." Across the void, in secret docks and hidden harbors all over human space, 1,000 ships roared to life. Engines hummed, weapon systems charged, crews scrambled to their battle stations. 1,000 ships, each one a technological marvel the galaxy had no idea even existed, got ready to make their grand entrance. Chen walked back to the observation window, her eyes on the stars. Out there, 50,000 refugees were huddled together in fear, just waiting for the end to come. They had no idea that help was on the way. They had no idea that a species they'd never met had been watching over them, caring about them, and preparing for this very day. Commander Webb came to stand beside her. "Admiral, after this, there's no going back. The whole galaxy will know who we are. They'll be afraid of us." "Let them," Chen said softly. "Fear can be a useful tool, but I hope they'll also understand." "Understand what, ma'am?" "That we didn't build this fleet to rule. We built it to shield. Every ship, every weapon, every soldier has one job: to stand between the innocent and anyone who tries to harm them." She paused for a moment. "The galaxy has had plenty of empires. It's had alliances built on profit and power. What it's never had is a guardian." Chen offered a small, sad smile. "And that's what we are. That's what we chose to be. Not rulers, not masters, guardians." She turned to face Webb. "In 12 hours, we're going to save 50,000 lives, and after that, we'll deal with the fallout of showing our hand. The conquered will scream for answers. Some will call us a threat. Others will try to use us. How do we navigate that?" "One step at a time," she replied. "First, we save the refugees. Then, we introduce ourselves to the galaxy and tell them exactly what we stand for." With a slight shrug, she accepted it. From this point on, they would see what kind of future they could forge together. The hours crawled by. Chen went over the strategic plans, met with her captains, and snatched moments of rest whenever she could, though sleep never truly came. Her mind kept replaying the incredible moment that was about to unfold. when 1,000 human warships would materialize from nothing and reshape the galaxy for good. At last, the countdown hit 0. "All ships report green," Commander Webb's voice announced crisply. "The fleet is ready for the jump." Chen settled into her command chair, her eyes sweeping across the bridge one final time. Every face was a mask of pure resolve. Every officer was prepared. "Signal the fleet," she ordered. "Execute the jump." The stars warped into streaks of light as 1,000 vessels ripped a hole in the fabric of space-time, hurtling toward a station filled with terrified refugees and a Verkari fleet that had absolutely no clue what was about to hit them. Humanity's days of hiding were over. Sanctuary Station was on its last legs. The Verkari battle group had shown up a full 2 hours early, catching the station's meager defense force completely by surprise. Not that there was much of a force to begin with. A few converted freighters and a handful of obsolete patrol boats were staring down 60 state-of-the-art warships, including 3 heavy cruisers and the personal flagship of the fleet's commander, Torax. Station Master Priath could only watch the tactical display, her heart sinking with every passing second. She was getting on in years. Her scales had faded to a washed-out gray, and she'd witnessed far too much loss in her long life. She had established Sanctuary Station 12 years ago, hoping it would be a place of peace for those fleeing war. Now, it was about to become their tomb. "The Verkari are demanding our unconditional surrender," her communications officer relayed, his voice tight. "They've offered to accept the station's inhabitants as property of the hegemony." Enslavement. That's what the sanitized language really meant. 50,000 souls who had already lost everything were about to lose their freedom too. "What's the Concord's response?" Priath asked, already dreading the answer. "The emergency session is still deadlocked. They haven't reached a decision." Of course they hadn't. The Concord would talk and debate while her people were being led to their deaths. That was the grim reality of this galaxy. The powerful did whatever they wanted, and the weak paid the price. "Tell the Verkari we need more time to deliberate their terms," Priath said, grasping at straws. "Stall them for as long as you can." It was a futile gesture. A few more minutes wouldn't change the final outcome, but it might give a few more children a chance to make it to the escape pods. It might give a few families time for one last goodbye. Aboard the bridge of the Verkari flagship, Dominance, Fleet Commander Torax chuckled at the station's desperate attempt to delay the inevitable. He was a seasoned conqueror, a veteran of a dozen campaigns, and he'd come to savor these moments. The palpable fear of the weak was almost as sweet as their eventual submission. "They're asking for time," his communications officer reported with a smirk. "Give them 10 minutes, Torax declared. "Then commence the assault. I want this wrapped up before the Concord miraculously grows a spine." His officers shared a laugh at the absurd notion. The Concord growing a spine was less likely than the stars blinking out. Torax leaned back in his command chair, watching the tactical display. Sanctuary Station hung in the void like a cornered animal, his fleet circling for the kill. In an hour, maybe less, it would all be his. The refugees would be processed, the useful ones shipped off to labor camps, the rest simply discarded. Just another victory for the hegemony. "Commander," his sensor officer suddenly called out, "I'm picking up something unusual." "Elaborate on unusual." "There are massive energy signatures blooming at the system's edge, a lot of them. The pattern is completely unfamiliar." Torax scowled, his eyes fixed on the display. His officer was right. Something strange was happening at the system's fringe, just beyond the reach of his detailed scanners. The signatures were bizarre, unlike any fold space entry he'd ever witnessed. "How many contacts are we talking about?" he demanded. The sensor officer's face turned ashen. "Commander, I'm reading over 1,000 distinct signatures." "That's impossible." "I'm running diagnostics now, sir." The officer's fingers flew across his console. "Commander, they're resolving into ships, 1,000 vessels inbound, moving at incredible speed." Before Torax could even process the words, space itself seemed to rip open. 1,000 points of brilliant light erupted across the blackness as ship after ship dropped out of fold space, assembling in a flawless geometric formation. These vessels were colossal, dwarfing anything in his own fleet, and they moved with a synchronized grace that hinted at technology far beyond his comprehension. "What in the stars is this?" Torax roared. "Identify those ships." "Unknown configuration, Commander. There's nothing like them in our databases." The sensor officer's voice was shaking. "They're positioning themselves around the station. They're boxing us in." 1,000 ships formed a perfect sphere, enclosing both Sanctuary Station and his own fleet. Their weapon ports were open, all aimed directly at the Verkari warships. Torax had never seen such a display of power. No civilization in the galaxy could muster a force of this magnitude. No one possessed ships this advanced. Suddenly, his communications console beeped with an incoming hail. "This is Admiral Chen Wei of the Terran Defense Fleet." The voice was calm, steady, and spoke flawless galactic standard. For the first time in decades, Torax felt a cold knot of dread tighten in his stomach. Fear. "We are not here to negotiate," the voice continued coolly. "We are not here to participate in your political debates. We are here because 50,000 people are about to be exterminated if someone doesn't step in. Verkari commanders, you have 10 minutes to withdraw your forces from this system. Comply, and your ships will not be fired upon. This is your first and only warning." The transmission cut out. Torax just stared at his screen, his mind reeling. Humans. The backwater species that had been cowering at the galaxy's edge for 80 years. The same species everyone had written off as a footnote in history. They had built this fleet. "Commander, your orders?" Torax glanced at the 1,000 alien ships that now held his fleet in a cage of light. They were beautiful in a horrifying way, sleek, powerful, and designed for one thing: war. If these humans had wanted to obliterate his fleet, they could have done it in an instant. Instead, they had offered him a way out. For a split second, Torax actually considered retreat. His survival was more important than his pride, and only an idiot would fight a battle he couldn't possibly win. But then he remembered the consequences of failure. The hegemony had no tolerance for it. Returning home with his fleet intact but the mission failed would mean a quiet, public execution. He'd rather die fighting than face that disgrace. "All ships, assume attack formation," he commanded, his voice strained. "Target the closest human vessel. Let's show these primitives how the hegemony deals with those who meddle in our affairs." His officers froze for a moment. Several looked as if they wanted to object, but years of rigid discipline took over, and the Verkari fleet slowly began to advance. Aboard the bridge of the Prometheus, Admiral Chen watched the enemy ship shift into an attack pattern. She wasn't surprised. The Verkari were an arrogant race, too proud to back down without a fight. It was a pride that was about to cost them dearly. "All ships, weapons free," she said calmly. "Disable, do not destroy. I want their crews taken alive." And so the battle began. It was over in 4 minutes and 23 seconds. The human fleet moved as one, a perfectly synchronized orchestra of destruction. Their weapons were unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen before, beams of focused energy that could pinpoint and disable individual systems without piercing the hull. Engines flickered and died. Weapon batteries fell silent. Shield generators overloaded and sputtered out. One by one, the mighty Verkari warships went dark and adrift in space, not destroyed, just neutralized. Their crews were alive and their ships were whole, but they were helpless, unable to fight and unable to run. The Dominance was the last ship to be silenced. Torax watched in stunned disbelief as his bridge went dark around him. His weapons were offline, his engines were dead, even his communications were completely jammed. Then, a single transmission broke through the silence. "Fleet Commander Torax," Admiral Chen's voice echoed on his dead bridge. "Your vessels have been incapacitated. Your crews will be taken into custody and returned to your government after processing. We will provide medical attention for your wounded, but make no mistake, your conquest is over." The channel went dead. Torax slumped in his chair in the oppressive darkness, trying to make sense of what just happened. His entire fleet of 60 warships had been systematically dismantled in less than 5 minutes, and the humans hadn't sustained a single casualty. What in the universe had they been doing for the last 80 years? On Sanctuary Station, Station Master Priyeth watched the tactical display, tears streaming freely down her weathered face. The Vakari fleet was a collection of dark, powerless hulks, completely encircled by the human armada. Medical shuttles were already launching from the human carriers, heading toward the crippled ships to tend to the enemy's wounded. Her communications officer's voice was tight. "Station Master, we're getting a signal from the human flagship." "On screen," she ordered. A woman's face appeared, older, with strands of gray in her hair and eyes that held a steady calm. "Station Master, I'm Admiral Chen Wei. Sanctuary Station is no longer in danger. We are sending humanitarian vessels to help with whatever you need. Do not be alarmed by our fleet." Pry tried to form words, but her throat closed up. The one question that had been burning inside her finally broke free. "Why?" she choked out. "Why are you helping us?" Admiral Chen offered a smile, and it was filled with genuine warmth. "Because somebody had to. Because we were able to. And because this is what our people believe in." "But you don't owe us a thing," Pry insisted. "We aren't your people." "Today you are," Chen replied with simple gravity. "Get some rest, Station Master. You're under our protection now." The screen went dark. Pry collapsed into her chair and finally let herself weep. For 12 long years, she had watched the galaxy turn a blind eye to the suffering of refugees. For 12 years, she had pleaded with the conquered for aid that was never sent. And now, out of the deep dark, salvation had arrived. She couldn't understand it, and maybe she never would. But for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she felt a flicker of something she thought was long dead. Hope. Miles away, on Velithos Prime, the Concord's emergency meeting had exploded into utter chaos. The news of the battle had just reached them, and the delegates were reeling, unable to grasp what had just happened. Imagine being told your very existence was a crime. That's the reality for 50,000 refugees cornered and about to be annihilated by a fleet of 1,000 warships from the powerful Vakari hegemony. But just as their shields were about to fail, something impossible happened. An unknown fleet appeared, disabling the aggressors in minutes with technology that made the most advanced ships in the galaxy look like children's toys. The question is, were these newcomers saviors or a new kind of threat? Stick with me to find out. In the Galactic Council, Ambassador Varith's scales flashed with colors of pure fury. "This is an act of war," he roared. "The humans attacked a hegemony fleet without provocation." The Salathi representative shot back. "Without provocation? Your fleet was about to slaughter 50,000 souls. Those refugees were harboring our enemies. We had every right. You had no right to anything." A voice sliced through the chaos, silencing the entire chamber. High Chancellor Morvath stood at the central podium, her silver robes shimmering. Her expression was a mask of calm, but her eyes blazed with a fire that hushed every voice in the great hall. "For 80 years, we ignored the humans," she declared, her voice resonating in every corner. "We called them primitive, irrelevant. We mistook their silence for weakness." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "We were wrong." With a touch to her console, the main view screen flickered to life, showing the battle from conquered spy satellites. 1,000 ghost ships dropping out of hyperspace, the Vakari fleet crumbling in mere minutes, and then human medical teams treating the enemy soldiers they had just defeated. "The humans have shown their hand," Morvath said. "And now, we must decide our response. But before we argue, I want you to consider something." She scanned the room, making eye contact with delegates from 100 worlds. The humans could have vaporized the Vakari fleet. They chose to disable it. They could have let those crews suffocate in the void. They chose to save them. The thought hung in the air, heavy and unbelievable. Whatever the humans are, whatever their goal is, they are not like us. They don't operate the way we do. And maybe, she added softly, That's exactly what this broken galaxy needs. The chamber exploded into 100 different arguments, but Morvith wasn't listening anymore. She was already thinking about the next step. A private meeting with an admiral named Chen, and the dawn of a new era for a galaxy that had just been turned completely upside down. The humans were done hiding in the shadows. They had made their grand entrance. Aboard the human carrier Mercy, the medical bay was a sea of tranquility, filled only with the gentle chime of heart monitors. In bed after bed lay the wounded Vicari soldiers, their injuries treated, their pain gone, their lives saved by the very people they'd been sent to destroy. Lieutenant Kareth was one of them, staring up at the ceiling, trying to process the impossible. Just 12 hours ago, he was psyching himself up to lead an assault on that refugee station. Now, he was a prisoner of war, and his captors were bringing him a cup of water. A human woman approached his bed. She was smaller than he was used to, with warm brown skin and hands that moved with a gentle confidence. She wore a medic's uniform and was holding a tray with a bowl of something warm. "How are you feeling?" she asked, her galactic standard accent flawless. Kareth didn't answer right away. He was trying to make sense of a situation that defied all logic. His warship had been crippled, its life support systems failing catastrophically. He had braced himself for the cold, dark end. Instead, human rescue teams had sliced through the hull of his ship and pulled him out of the wreckage. "Why?" he finally rasped, his throat raw from smoke. "Why? What?" she asked gently. "Why help me? I'm your enemy. My orders were to eliminate everyone on that station." He paused, the words tasting like ash. "We would have killed you too." The human medic set down the tray and pulled a chair next to his bed. "You were following orders," she said simply. "You were doing what your government commanded. That doesn't make it right, but it doesn't automatically make you a monster either." "That's not an answer," he growled. "No," she admitted after a moment's thought. "I suppose it isn't. We help you because this is who we've chosen to be. We built our fleet to defend the innocent, absolutely, but we also built it knowing that the soldiers on the other side are still people. You have homes, you have people you love, you matter." Kareth just shook his head slowly. The hegemony would never show this kind of mercy. If your ships were dead in the water, our medics wouldn't be saving you. Your survivors would be put in chains or executed. "I know," she said. "Then why?" he begged. "Because we are not you." The words were so simple, yet they hit him with the force of a cannon. "We could be," she continued. "We have enough power to do anything we want, but we chose a different path. We chose to be better." Kareth fell silent for a long, long time. His entire life, he'd been taught that strength was about domination, that power meant absolute control, and that mercy was just a weakness to be exploited. And now, lying in an enemy medbay, being cared for by a species he'd been trained to hate, his entire worldview was shattering. "What's going to happen to us?" he finally asked. "You'll be kept here until the diplomats work things out. Then you'll be sent home to your government. No one will be hurt. No one will be mistreated." She stood up and nodded toward the tray she'd brought. "Eat something. You need your strength to recover." As she walked off to care for another of his crewmates, Kareth was left alone with his thoughts and a bowl of warm soup that smelled, to his utter surprise, incredibly delicious. Meanwhile, on the other side of the galaxy, High Chancellor Morvith's shuttle neared the human flagship, the Prometheus. She had demanded this meeting herself, ignoring the panicked warnings of her advisors. Admiral Chen had agreed instantly. The shuttle bay of the Prometheus was breathtakingly huge, big enough to swallow a dozen of her own capital ships. As her shuttle landed, she saw a delegation waiting for her, their crisp uniforms a stark contrast to the chaos in her own government. Admiral Chen stood at the front of the group. She was shorter than Morvith expected, but she carried herself with an unshakable confidence that demanded respect. "High Chancellor," Chen said, extending a hand in the traditional human greeting. "Welcome aboard." Morvith carefully took the offered hand, remembering the customs she'd hastily studied. "Admiral Chen, thank you for seeing me. The conquered deserves an explanation." "After 80 years of silence," Chen replied with a slight smile, "I imagine you have a few questions." More than you could possibly imagine, Morvith admitted. Chen led her through the ship to a private conference room. It was simple, with a wall of windows showing the star-dusted void outside and a plain table in the middle. There were no guards, no weapons. It was just two leaders sitting across from one another. "Then ask," Chen invited. Morvith took a seat, trying to gather the 100 questions swirling in her mind. She'd rehearsed this for days, but now the most basic question felt the most important. "Why did you hide?" she finally asked. "Your technology is light years ahead of ours. You could have been running the galaxy from day one. Why the silence?" Chen's smile was tinged with sadness. "Because we came to your summits 80 years ago. We watched. We saw endless debates that solved nothing while entire worlds suffered. We saw the strong preying on the weak and the so-called alliance turning a blind eye. We looked at that system," she said, leaning forward, "and we decided we wanted no part of it." "So you chose isolation?" Morvith pressed. "No, we chose preparation. There's a big difference," Chen corrected her. "If we had revealed our power before we truly understood the galaxy, before we had the wisdom to match our strength, we would have just become another empire. We would have become conquerors, because that's what unchecked power does." "And what is it you want now?" "To build something new. Something better," Chen declared. "A galaxy where the strong actually protect the weak instead of feeding on them. A government where talking leads to real action, where we don't ignore suffering just because it's inconvenient to help." Morvith weighed the words. They were beautiful words, but she'd heard plenty of those before. "How do I know you won't just force this vision on us? Your fleet could shatter the conquered tomorrow if it wanted to." "Yes, it could," Chen agreed, her voice perfectly calm. "But it won't. We didn't spend 80 years building this fleet just to become the new bullies on the block. We built it to be guardians." "Guardians of what?" Morvith asked, skeptical. "Of everyone," Chen replied. "Every species, every planet, every single person who needs help. This galaxy has had its share of empires. It's had alliances based on greed. What it's never had is a power that exists for the sole purpose of defending those who can't defend themselves." Morvith was speechless for a long moment. In her long life, she'd met countless leaders and heard countless promises. Most were empty. But she saw something in Admiral Chen's eyes, a sincerity so profound it made her want to believe. "What do you ask of the Concord?" she asked. "Partnership," Chen said immediately. "Not obedience, not taxes, not control. Partnership. We want to work with anyone who shares our belief that power comes with responsibility." She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the stars. "The Vicari won't stop. This loss will just make them angrier. They'll rebuild, and they'll come back. The only way to stop the cycle for good is to build an alliance so strong that starting a fight becomes unthinkable. We're proposing a new coalition, an alliance for any species that buys into its principles. Humanity would be just one member among many, not the one in charge. We have zero interest in running anyone's lives but our own." Morvith got up and stood beside Chen at the window, staring out at the star-dusted blackness. An endless ocean of lights, each one a world, a people, a possibility. "You know, there are those you've conquered who will never, ever accept this," she said softly. "They'll see you as a threat no matter what you say." "I know, and they'll have to make their own choices. We won't drag anyone into this, but we also won't let anyone keep up the old game of exploitation. The days of just watching while the innocent get crushed are over." That sounds an awful lot like an ultimatum. "Call it a line in the sand. We've decided what we will and will not put up with. It's up to everyone else to decide how they want to react." Morvith turned, looking Chen straight in the eye. "I've been the High Chancellor for 60 years. I've watched the conquered promise greatness and fail over and over. I've watched whole species get carted off into slavery while we sat around debating the correct way to file a complaint. I've hated myself for being so powerless to change any of it." She took a breath, and when she spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion. "I don't know if I can trust you, Admiral. I don't know if this vision of yours is even possible. But I know for a fact that the old way is shattered beyond repair. If there's even a tiny chance we can build something better, I have to be a part of it." A real, warm smile finally broke across Chen's face. Then let's get started. 3 days later, Admiral Chen addressed the Galactic Concord. The Great Hall was so packed you couldn't find a single empty seat. Every species had sent a representative. The tension in the room was so thick you could taste it. Some of the delegates looked at Chen with pure terror. Others looked at her with a glimmer of hope, but most of them just looked utterly baffled. Chen stood at the central podium, all by herself, completely unarmed, ready to face the judgment of an entire galaxy. "I know you have questions," she started, her voice calm and clear. "I know you're scared. A new power has shown up out of the clear blue sky with technology you can't comprehend and motives you can't even begin to guess. If I were in your shoes, I'd be scared too." She scanned the massive chamber, trying to make eye contact with as many delegates as she could. "So let me tell you who we are. 80 years ago, humanity found out we weren't alone in the universe. You invited us to join your great civilization, so we sent observers to learn your ways. And what we saw absolutely broke our hearts." The giant display screen behind her flickered to life, showing images that many in the room wished they could forget. The Malari crisis, the endless pointless debates, the species that went extinct while the conquered did absolutely nothing. We watched 12 billion people die while this body argued about the proper response. We watched the Ricari enslave millions while you debated sanctions. We watched one atrocity after another, and we made a choice. Chen's voice grew hard as steel. We decided that we would never be part of a system that allowed such horrors to happen. But we also decided that when we finally stepped in, we would not become the very monsters we were fighting against. She gestured, and the display changed, now showing the battle at Sanctuary Station. The 1,000 ships, the entire Ricari fleet disabled in minutes, and human medical teams treating their wounded enemies. We built our fleet to protect the innocent. We built it with enough power to smash any force that preys on the helpless. But we also built it with the discipline to show mercy, to save lives even when it would be easier to just destroy everything. That's who we are. That's what we stand for. Chen paused, letting the weight of her words settle in the silent hall. "I'm not here to threaten you. I'm not here to demand that you bow to us. I'm here to offer you a choice. You can keep going just like you have been, arguing while innocent people suffer, protecting a system that helps the powerful and crushes the weak. Or you can join us and build something new." "And what exactly are you proposing?" Ambassador Breath shouted. His voice was dripping with hostility, but Chen could hear the fear shaking underneath it. "A coalition, open to any species that will commit to its core principles, that the strong have a duty to protect the weak, that aggression will not be tolerated, and that suffering must be answered with action, not words. Humanity will be one voice among many, not the ruler of anything. We're looking for partners, not subjects. And if we refuse, then you refuse. We won't force anyone to join us, but we also won't stand by and let the old patterns continue. If another species is threatened, if another population is facing slavery or extinction, we will act, with or without the conquered's approval." The chamber exploded into a storm of arguments, but Chen just stood there, waiting calmly for the noise to die down. "You have 80 years of our silence to think about," she said finally. 80 years where humanity watched and learned and prepared. We could have stepped in sooner. We chose to wait until we were sure we could do it right. She looked around the chamber one last time. "Now, we're ready. The question is, are you?" She stepped down from the podium and walked straight out of the Great Hall, leaving 200 species to argue about a future that had already begun. The galaxy was never going to be the same. A year had passed since the fight at Sanctuary Station, and the galaxy had been completely reshaped. The Ricari hegemony was gone, not because humanity had wiped it out, but because its own people had risen up against it. Once the conquered world saw that fighting back was actually possible, once they learned there was a power in the galaxy that would protect them, they found a courage they thought they'd lost forever. One world after another threw off the shackles of hegemony rule. The great empire crumbled from the inside out, leaving the Ricari to finally face the music for their centuries of cruelty. The galactic conquered itself had cracked. Some species held on to the old ways, hiding away in their own territories and just hoping the tidal wave of change would pass them by. Others had eagerly joined the new coalition. Humanity had helped start, dedicating themselves to the principles they'd always claimed to believe in, but had never actually put into practice. Admiral Chen Wei stood at the observation window of a space station, orbiting a world they now called New Dawn. 6 months ago, it had been a Vicari mining colony, a place worked by slaves from a dozen different species. Now, it was a sanctuary, a place where former slaves could come to heal and start their lives over. Human volunteers were working side by side with beings from all across the galaxy, building homes, schools, and hospitals. Medical teams were treating injuries some of these victims had been carrying for years. Teachers were helping children learn to read and write in their own native languages. These were skills the hegemony had strictly forbidden. Commander Webb came up to the window next to Chen. He looked like he'd aged a decade in the past year. They all had. Building something new, it turned out, was a lot harder than tearing something old down. The Salathi Republic has officially joined the coalition, he reported. That brings our total membership up to 47 species. Good. What about the holdouts? The usual. Ambassador Breath is still trying to stir up opposition, but nobody's really listening to him anymore. The Colossi Dominion is more worried about its own internal politics than any threats from the outside. Chen nodded. She'd expected there would be resistance and had planned for it. What she hadn't expected was just how fast everything would change once the first domino fell. There's something else, Webb said. Former Fleet Commander Torax has requested a meeting with you. He's been released from detention and sent back to Vicari space, but he says he has something important he needs to discuss. Now that was a surprise. Torax had been the commander of the fleet that had attacked Sanctuary Station. Capturing him had been one of the turning points of the battle. What does he want? He wouldn't say, but he traveled all the way here in person to ask. Chen thought about it for a second. Bring him to my office. Let's hear what the man has to say. 30 minutes later, Torax walked into Chen's private office. He was thinner than he'd been a year ago. His scales seemed dull, and he didn't carry himself with the same arrogance. Defeat had changed him in ways that were more than just skin deep. Admiral Chen, he said. His voice was formal, but there was respect in it. Thank you for agreeing to see me. Former fleet commander? Chen gestured to a chair. Please, sit. Torax sat down heavily, like he was carrying an immense weight. For a long moment, he just stared down at his own hands, trying to find the right words. I spent my entire life believing in the hegemony, he said at last. I believed that strength was the only thing that mattered, that power was meant to be used, and that the strong had a natural right to rule the weak. I killed for those beliefs. I conquered for them. I enslaved innocent people because I thought that was just the way the universe worked. He finally looked up at Chen. And then you crushed my entire fleet in 4 minutes without killing a single one of my soldiers. You captured me and you treated my wounds. You gave me food and water and spoke to me like I was a person, not just the enemy. You are a person, Chen said simply. That's the thing. I never understood that. I didn't get that you could treat enemies with dignity, that you could win without being cruel, that you could wield incredible power with compassion. Torax just shook his head. In your prison, I had nothing to do but think. I thought about every slave I'd ever taken, every world I'd conquered, every horrible thing I had done in the name of the hegemony. And I realized I had wasted my entire life serving a lie. Chen just listened, not saying a word. She'd seen this happen before with other Vicari prisoners, transformed by their first real experience with human mercy. It was one of those things that gave her hope for what was to come. The hegemony is finished, Torax said, his voice heavy. My people are scattered, broken. We have nothing left but our own shame. He sat up a little straighter in his chair, a flicker of his old military posture returning. But I've decided that shame can be the start of something new. I've come to offer my skills to the coalition. Now that was a surprise. In what role? Chen asked. Whatever role you find useful. I know Vicari military strategy better than anyone alive. I know where the hidden weapon stashes are, the names of war criminals who slipped through the cracks, the secrets the hegemony hid even from its own command. He paused for a moment. And I can talk to the other Vicari, he added, the ones who are lost and confused, who have no idea how to live in a galaxy that isn't about conquest. I can be the example that proves change is possible. Chen watched the old warrior, sizing him up. She'd gotten good at reading people over her long career, and she saw nothing but sincerity in Torax. All his old arrogance had been burned away by loss and quiet reflection. In its place was a man desperately searching for a way to make things right. You realize many species will never forgive the Vicari for what they did, she said gently. You might spend the rest of your life hated for crimes you can never take back. I know, he said, but I have to try. I have to do something, anything to help balance the scales, even if they can never be perfectly balanced again. He looked her straight in the eye. I'm told you humans have an expression. Something about the longest journey starting with just one step. A small smile touched Chen's lips. We do say that. Then let this be my first step, Torax declared. Whatever you need, whatever I can do to help, I'm ready. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm asking for the chance to earn it. Chen was silent for a long moment, thinking it over. Finally, she gave a slow nod. We have a program for former hegemony soldiers who want to make amends. You'd be starting at the very bottom, taking orders, not giving them, doing whatever work needs to be done. It won't be glamorous. I wouldn't expect it to be. Then welcome to the coalition, Torax. Let's see what you can build now that you're not destroying things. That evening, Chen went to a ceremony on the surface of New Dawn. A new community center was being opened, built by volunteers from a dozen different species. It was meant to be a gathering spot for the settlement's fast-growing population. The crowd was a mix of faces that would have been unimaginable just a year ago. Former slaves stood next to their former masters. Species that had been locked in war for centuries were now working side by side, hanging lights and setting up chairs. Their children played together, completely unaware of the histories of hate their parents had overcome. As the ceremony ended, a young woman approached Chen. She was from a species that had been crushed by the hegemony. Her people had been reduced to just a few thousand survivors before the coalition had freed them. Admiral Chen, she said nervously, her translator device working hard to keep up. Could I speak with you? Of course. I just wanted to say thank you. My family, we were slaves for 3 generations. My grandmother died in the mines. My mother worked until her body gave out. I was born in chains. Tears welled up in her eyes. And now, my children will be born free, all because of what you and your people did. Chen felt her own eyes begin to sting. We only did what anyone should have done a long, long time ago. But nobody else did, the young woman whispered. You did. She reached out and gently took Chen's hand. Is it true? That your people waited 100 years to act, that you could have come to help sooner? It was a question Chen had heard many times, and she still found the answer difficult. Yes, it's true, she admitted. We could have shown ourselves much earlier. Then why didn't you? Chen looked out at the diverse crowd, at the former slaves and former soldiers, figuring out how to live together. She saw the children who would grow up never knowing the horrors their parents had endured. Because if we had come then, she said softly, we would have come as conquerors, not as liberators. We needed time to figure out how to be strong without becoming the very monsters we were fighting against. The young woman thought about this for a moment. So what happens now? Chen smiled, her mind drifting back to a conversation with High Chancellor Morph a year ago, when everything was so uncertain and the future was a blank page. Now, she said, we build something worth protecting. When the ceremony was over, the crowd melted away into the warm night air. Chen took a walk through the settlement, watching families head back to their homes, seeing lights turn on in windows, witnessing a real community rise from the ashes of an empire. A year ago, Humanity had shown up at Sanctuary Station with 1,000 warships and changed the galaxy in an instant. But it was never about the warships. What really mattered was everything that came after. The choices made, the principles they stood for, and the hard, grinding work of building something new from scratch. The coalition wasn't perfect, and it never would be. There would be disagreements, setbacks, and times when the old, ugly habits would try to creep back in. But there would also be progress, slow, steady progress toward a future where the powerful protected the weak instead of preying on them. Chen made her way back to her shuttle as the first stars began to appear in the sky. She had a busy day tomorrow, meetings with new species wanting to join, talks with those still on the fence, and plans for the next stage of rebuilding. The work would never really be over. But that was okay. That was what hope looked like in practice. For thousands of years, the galaxy had been ruled by empires. It had been run by alliances based on mutual gain and cold, calculated self-interest. It had never had a guardian, a power that existed just to shield those who couldn't shield themselves. Now it did. And somewhere out in that vast emptiness of space, aboard the Prometheus and 1,000 other ships just like it, humanity was standing watch, ready to answer the call whenever the innocent needed help. They weren't conquerors. They weren't masters. They weren't rulers of anything but themselves. They were something the galaxy had never seen before and might never fully grasp. They were guardians. The empty chair at the Concord Summit was finally filled. Humanity had at last taken its place among the stars, and the long job of building a better future was only just getting started.